I'm not ashamed.
Will there be marriage in heaven? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Matthew on walking through the Bible.
Of his word, the glory of his cross.
If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Matthew chapter 22. We're going to be reading from verses 23 to 33. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, Matthew chapter 22, beginning at verse 23. The same day the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to him and asked him, saying, Teacher, Moses said that if a man dies having no children, his brother shall marry his wife and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were with us 7 brothers. The first died after he had married, and having no offspring, left his wife to his brother. Likewise the second also, and the third even to the 7th. Last of all, the woman died also. Therefore, in the resurrection, whose wife of the 7 will she be? For they all had her. Jesus answered and said to them, You are mistaken, not knowing the Scriptures, nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry, nor are given in marriage, but are like the angels of God in heaven. But concerning the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was spoken to you by God, saying, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob? God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. And when the multitudes heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. The events we just read occurred on the Tuesday before Jesus was crucified. The Pharisees had just been thwarted in their attempt to trap Jesus in his words, so now it was the Sadducees' turn. While we've come across the Pharisees numerous times in the book, we've only come across the Sadducees a couple times, the last being in chapter 16, lessons 80 and 81 of this series. So let's quickly refresh our memories as to who the Sadducees were. The Sadducees were yet another sect of the Jews, many of whom were priests in the temple, but on the whole, most Sadducees occupied the upper echelons of Jewish society, and as such, had a vast amount of wealth and power. As for their beliefs, it is thought that they held that the only authority to be followed was what God revealed in the Old Testament, especially the first 5 books which contained the law of Moses, and thus they rejected the oral traditions that the scribes and Pharisees taught were also binding. As such, since they didn't explicitly read of any resurrection, they didn't believe in it. They felt that this life was all that there is, and that there was no rewards or punishments in the afterlife. But at death, the spirit went to Sheol, which they believed was a place of stillness and darkness, cut off from life and from God. The spirit would remain in this gloomy place for all of eternity, devoid of any personality or strength. Believing this to be true, it is no wonder that the Sadducees wanted to live it up in this life, for at death, all that awaited them was sadness and despair. It is the lack of belief in the resurrection that brings them to Jesus with a question that they thought was impossible to answer, and as such show the doctrine of the resurrection to be false. Their question was set up by the following scenario. There was a woman whose husband died with no children. Under the law of Moses found in Deuteronomy 25, 5-10, the deceased man's brother was to marry the widow and raise up a son that would inherit his father's estate. Now in the Sadducees story, the deceased brother had 6 other brothers. The widow married the eldest brother, who then died before giving her any children. She then married the 3rd brother, and the same thing happened. In fact, this widow, one by one, married each of the remaining brothers, and they all died without giving her any children. Personally speaking, if I was brother 6 or 7, and it became my turn to marry this widow, I might have second thoughts. For what happened that caused all of my brothers to die after marrying this widow? Alas, though, this was the Sadducee story, and that's what they told Jesus. Finally, after marrying all these brothers and having them all die without giving her children, the widow died also. So their question was, in the resurrection, whose wife would she be? For these brothers were all married to her at some point in time. What the Sadducees had done is make up a scenario so absurd that they thought it would disprove the resurrection, for how could this woman possibly be married to all of these 7 men should the resurrection exist? Jesus, in answering their question, rebuked them for not understanding the Scriptures or the power of God. That was quite an insult, for the Sadducees were well-learned people, ones who claimed to follow the law of Moses quite closely, even avoiding man-made traditions. How dare Jesus say that they did not understand the Scriptures or the power of God? What was their misunderstanding? Well, for one, they failed to recognize that marriage is an earthly institution made by God solely for this earth. Once people die, marriage is over. So God wouldn't be prevented in raising someone from the dead simply because they had more than one spouse, nor would there be any difficulty after the resurrection as it concerns the woman and these 7 brothers. That's because in the resurrection we will not be married nor given in marriage, but will be like the angels in that regard. But they misunderstood the scriptures in another way, which was that in Exodus 3 verse 6, when God appeared to Moses in the burning bush, he said that he was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These men had been dead for a few hundred years by that point, and yet God was still their God on an individual level. Jesus' point was that God is the God of the living, not the dead. And so at that point in time, even though the patriarchs were physically dead, their individual spirits were still alive, thus contradicting the Sadducees' belief about death and the resurrection. Since the spirit lives on, it must live on for a purpose, which of course is the resurrection of the dead, a day which the righteous will receive heaven and the wicked will receive hell. Everyone again was astonished at Jesus' teaching, for Jesus had outmaneuvered the Sadducees in answering a question that they thought was impossible to answer. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Matthew 22, verses 34 to 40, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time.
I'm not a
Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.
of his cross.